Forget what Hollywood taught you about medieval archery. It was far more brutal, expensive, and demanding than you can imagine. We're diving deep into the often overlooked financial burdens faced by archers, revealing the harsh economic realities behind every shot. Prepare to have your perceptions shattered. The longbow, the crossbow, the composite recurve, names that evoke images of silent precision, deadly skill, and the noble art of war. Yet for those who lived in the Middle Ages, these weapons were not romantic symbols of heroism. They were instruments of survival, economic investment, and social obligation. An arrow was not a mere shaft of wood with a point at one end. It was the culmination of countless hours of labor, resources gathered from multiple regions, and craftsmanship so precise it bordered on the sacred. To be an archer in medieval Europe was to exist in a world where every shot carried a price tag. A price not just in coin, but in hours of preparation, in favors owed, and in the constant balancing of necessity against scarcity. It's easy to imagine a yeoman standing proudly at a battlefield's edge, loosing arrow after arrow into an advancing enemy. But what most overlook is that each arrow represented not just the potential to take a life, but also a literal expenditure, a decision to release something that could not be easily replaced. The economic burden began long before battle. The longbow itself was an artifact of specialized craftsmanship. In England, for example, the preferred yew trees were so rare that laws had to be enacted requiring every ship entering port to bring a quota of yew staves from the continent. These staves traveled hundreds of miles before they even reached the bowyer's bench, each one carefully seasoned for years before being shaped. A well-made longbow could cost the equivalent of weeks, sometimes months, of a laborer's wages, an investment that could ruin a family if lost, broken, or stolen. And then there were the arrows. The simplest war arrow required ash or birch for the shaft, goose or swan feathers for the fletching, and an iron head forged to exacting specifications. For specialized targets, such as armored knights, bodkin points were forged by blacksmiths, trained in the delicate balance between piercing capability and weight distribution. Each arrowhead might take hours to forge, each feather to be cut and bound with linen thread, each shaft to be straightened and smoothed by hand. This was not mass production. It was artisan work on a scale few today appreciate, and the costs didn't end there. Maintaining an archer's kit was a constant drain. Bowstrings, for example, were notoriously fragile, often made from hemp, flax, or animal sinew, and could snap without warning in damp weather. A prudent archer carried multiple spares, each painstakingly twisted and waxed. Replacing a single string might require an entire day's earnings. In times of scarcity, archers often scavenged the battlefield after a fight, retrieving arrows from corpses and the ground, even straightening bent shafts by firelight, because losing too many meant financial ruin. But the hidden costs went beyond materials. There was the unrelenting training. In England, the Assize of Arms and later laws under Edward III mandated that every able-bodied man practice archery on Sundays and holidays, forbidding distractions like football or dice games. For those who worked the land, this meant hours of labor lost, time that could have been spent tending crops, repairing tools, or working for wages. And yet failure to practice was not an option. It could result in fines, public shaming, or worse, suspicion of disloyalty to the crown. Then there was the toll on the body. The draw weight of a war bow could exceed 120 pounds. This was not the kind of archery seen in modern sport, where 40 or 50 pounds is considered substantial, but an act that permanently reshaped the musculature and skeleton of those who wielded it. Excavated remains of medieval archers reveal enlarged bones in the arms and shoulders, asymmetrical spines, and deformed wrists. Mastery came not just from discipline, but from physically altering oneself to serve the weapon. The cost was written into the body, in the form of chronic pain and premature joint damage that we must also consider the political economy behind the archer's place in society. Unlike knights, who often brought their own wealth to the battlefield, archers were frequently contracted or levied. Payment might come in coin, loot, or in rare cases, land. But more often it was a pittance, barely enough to replace spent arrows or repair damaged equipment. And yet, these men stood at the heart of some of the most decisive battles in history. Crecy, Poitiers, Agincourt. Their skill could turn the tide of war, yet their pockets remained nearly empty, their survival dependent, not just on their aim, but on their ability to manage an unending list of expenses. This is where the story takes a darker turn. For there were whispers, then, as now, that some archers sought ways to reduce these costs not through thrift, but through forbidden means. Rumors of bows strung with human sinew for added strength, of arrowheads forged from meteoric iron believed to pierce any armor, of fletching cut from the wings of rare, near-mythical birds whose feathers granted impossible flight paths. Were these simply tales to frighten rivals, or do they hint at a deeper, older tradition, one in which archery was not merely a military skill, but a conduit for ancient knowledge? Artifacts found in remote burial sites have puzzled archaeologists. For decades, arrowheads with microgrooves that seemed too precise for medieval forging methods, wooden shafts coated in a resin that resists decay for centuries, quivers engraved with geometric patterns uncannily similar to those found in pre-Christian megalithic sites. Were these the products of lost techniques, perhaps handed down from an earlier civilization? Or do they suggest a hidden lineage of craftsmen whose skills skirted the edges of sanctioned knowledge, risking accusations of sorcery? The economic burden of medieval archery was real, measurable, and devastating. But it may have also served as a gatekeeper, ensuring that only those with resources, connections, or access to esoteric knowledge could truly master the art. And, as with all gatekeepers, there is reason to wonder, who controlled the flow of such knowledge? Who decided which methods would be taught, and which buried? Because in the long shadows of history, we find that every weapon tells two stories, the one recorded in chronicles, and the one whispered in the dark, where skill, survival, and secrecy become indistinguishable. The deeper one peers into the history of medieval archery, the more it begins to resemble a carefully guarded ledger, one in which not only money and resources were tallied, but influence, allegiance, and hidden knowledge. The battlefield was only the most visible arena in which archers operated. Their real significance stretched into the courts of kings, the dealings of merchants, and the shadowed halls where policy and warfare converged. The recruitment of archers was never simply about numbers. In many cases, it was about securing men who were tethered to their lord not merely by duty, but by dependency. Archery, with its relentless upkeep costs, bound its practitioners to patrons. Without noble sponsorship, the average archer could not afford the constant supply of arrows, replacement gear, or the travel to muster points. It created a quiet hierarchy. Those under the direct payroll of a baron or knight were effectively bound agents, obligated to fight not only in official wars, but also in private skirmishes, disputes over land, and the suppression of local uprisings. Records from the 14th century reveal royal accounts meticulously listing payments to master bowyers and fletchers whose work was earmarked exclusively for royal retinues. Such monopolies meant that innovations in bow design, arrowhead metallurgy, or fletching aerodynamics rarely spread beyond elite circles. Even when a breakthrough occurred, say, an arrowhead that could penetrate the new Italian plate armor, the knowledge was often quietly purchased, patented in secrecy, and restricted to a few chosen companies. The public face of archery training remained unchanged, while behind the scenes, the tools evolved in ways most common soldiers would never see. And then there are the stranger accounts, the ones buried deep in chroniclers' marginal notes or hinted at in monastic inventories. A single line about a bough carved from a tree that sings at night. A passing remark on arrows that seek the gaps between plates as if guided by a knowing hand. Such descriptions have long been dismissed as poetic exaggeration or scribal fancy. But what if they point to something else, something akin to a parallel tradition of archery, where the weapon was as much an instrument of ritual as of war? One of the most puzzling pieces of evidence comes from the excavation of a medieval hunting lodge in the Black Forest. Among the debris of broken furniture and rusted kitchen knives, archaeologists found a quiver containing 3 arrows, each tipped with an alloy not native to the region. Metallurgical analysis showed traces of nickel and cobalt in proportions suggestive of meteoric origin, metal that had literally fallen from the sky. These were no crude experiments. The arrowheads were shaped with microscopic ridges along the cutting edge, almost like the serrations of a modern surgical blade. No surviving records explain who owned them or how they were used. This brings us to a recurring question in suppressed histories. When knowledge of extraordinary materials or methods surfaced in medieval Europe, how did it disappear? One explanation is simple suppression, church or crown declaring certain practices heretical or dangerous. Another possibility is more unnerving, that such techniques were never lost, but sequestered, absorbed into the private arsenals of those in power, only to be destroyed or hidden when they no longer served a purpose. Consider the peculiar fate of the crossbow in England. Its power to pierce armor so alarmed the nobility that in 1139, the Second Lateran Council attempted to ban its use against Christians, declaring it hateful to God. While ostensibly a moral decision, some historians suspect it had a more pragmatic motive. The crossbow gave too much killing power to commoners, eroding the military advantage of the knightly elite. Bans and restrictions were not merely about morality. They were about control, about keeping certain tools out of the hands of those who might disrupt the established order. The longbow itself may have escaped such direct prohibition in England. But elsewhere, the arc of its story hints at quiet suppression. Documents from the Republic of Venice mention fines for transporting large bundles of used staves without special license, a measure officially meant to prevent shortages, but which conveniently kept the highest quality bow-making material in the hands of approved guilds. The guild system, while a safeguard for quality, was also a barrier against the free exchange of techniques. Within the highest ranks of these guilds, there may have been knowledge not shared even with most members, methods for treating wood to resist warping, or recipes for glues that could withstand rain and cold without losing tension. It is here that myth and reality entwine most tightly. In the Chronicles of the Livonian Order, there is a brief but curious mention of arrow wisdom granted to certain warriors after days spent in fasting and isolation. The implication is clear. Archery was not always a purely physical discipline. In some traditions, the bow and arrow were tools of initiation, each shot an act of focus and intention, designed to align the archer not just with his target, but with forces beyond the visible. Whether these were simply exercises in concentration or remnants of an older, more arcane worldview, they speak to a time when martial skill and spiritual practice could be intertwined. And perhaps this is why certain aspects of medieval archery have slipped into obscurity, not because they were irrelevant, but because they straddle the line between sanctioned craft and forbidden knowledge. To teach such methods openly might have risked accusations of witchcraft or paganism. To keep them hidden was to preserve them for a chosen few. That if there is one thread running through all these accounts, it is that archery was never simply the act of loosing an arrow. It was a convergence of economics, politics, craft, and, perhaps, something older, more enigmatic. Every bow drawn in the Middle Ages carried within it not just the force of a man's arm, but the accumulated weight of laws, guild secrets, and the silent inheritance of techniques whose origins may predate recorded history itself. And yet, as with so many technologies in the medieval world, the most intriguing question remains: what was deliberately erased? For in scattered letters and confiscated manuscripts, there are hints of something beyond even the longbow's celebrated range and power. Methods of propulsion and guidance that sound suspiciously modern, as if a fragment of another age had slipped into the wrong century. In the next chapter, we follow those fragments, tracing the faint outlines of an archery that was not bound to the limits of muscle and wood, but may have brushed against principles we are only now beginning to understand again. Before we go deeper into the final and most hidden layers of this story, if you felt the weight of what we've uncovered so far, let your thoughts be known. Every perspective you share shapes which histories rise from the shadows next. And if you want to keep walking with me into the unlit corridors of the past, you know where to find the path. There are moments in history when an innovation appears far ahead of its time, so far that it disrupts the neat progression of technological evolution. In the case of medieval archery, there are rare, almost unbelievable accounts of weapons that seem to operate outside the known limits of wood, sinew, and human strength. They appear suddenly in the record, then vanish just as quickly, leaving only puzzling relics and the uneasy suspicion that they were never meant to be remembered. One such case is recorded in a confiscated ledger from the port city of Lubeck, dated 1481. Among shipments of grain, wool, and timber, there is a discreet notation for a delivery described simply as bows of the silent arc. They were imported in quantities too small for military deployment, perhaps only a dozen, yet valued at 10 times the price of a mastercrafted longbow. No surviving description explains the term silent arc, but the name invites speculation. A weapon designed to eliminate the telltale snap of a bowstring, to strike without warning. More tantalizing still are the arrowheads recovered from a buried structure beneath the old walls of York. Encased in soil for centuries, they remained unerringly sharp, their edges almost impervious to corrosion. Modern metallurgical analysis suggests a compound not found in any other medieval artifact, a mix of iron, carbon, and a trace element that resists easy identification. The most controversial theory is that it is vanadium, a metal associated with high-grade steel centuries, ahead of its documented use in Europe. If true, it raises a disturbing possibility that these arrowheads were crafted using techniques imported or perhaps inherited from a civilization now erased from the historical narrative. This dovetails with the whispered accounts in certain monastic libraries of ballistic manuscripts, texts said to contain formulas for calculating trajectory, wind compensation, and projectile stability with uncanny precision. These were not the simple range tables used by gunners in the early age of cannons, but mathematical treatises written in a style uncomfortably reminiscent of Greek geometry or Arabic astronomy. Some even describe an engine for projecting arrows beyond the limits of human draw weight, a design abandoned, supposedly, because it disturbed the balance of war. Whether such devices were prototypes of mechanical bows or something far stranger, the fact remains: no complete copy of these manuscripts survives. The question is, why? Why would such advancements vanish? Some historians blame the natural loss of knowledge through war, plague, and the decay of materials. But others see a more deliberate pattern, one that matches similar erasures in navigation, medicine, and architecture: the quiet removal of disruptive knowledge from circulation when it threatened the established hierarchy. If a common archer could wield a weapon that ignored armor, wind, and distance, the medieval battlefield and the medieval power structure would have been transformed overnight. It's worth noting that in certain cultures far from Europe, echoes of these advanced archery traditions lingered. In the steppes of Central Asia, composite bows capable of astonishing ranges were perfected, their lamination techniques rivaling modern engineering. In Japan, ceremonial archery retained a ritualized form where the archer's intent and breath were said to guide the arrow as much as muscle strength. And in the Middle East, manuscripts on projectile physics survived under the care of scholars, who, perhaps wisely, cloaked their knowledge in metaphor and allegory. Could it be that Europe, too, once had such a tradition, only for it to be silenced? When we compare the archaeological anomalies, the scattered mentions in restricted guild records, and the odd congruences with distant technologies, the possibility grows harder to ignore. It suggests that medieval archery was not merely the story of men and their bows, but a fragment of a far older human relationship with precision, range, and control, one that may reach back into prehistory. The tragedy is that the most compelling evidence will likely never be unearthed in full. The tools of this other archery were designed for use, not for preservation. Wooden bows rot, sinew strings decay, and even the finest arrow shafts succumb to time. What remains are the metals, the engravings, and the occasional, inexplicable survival of an object that seems to have resisted the centuries. These are the breadcrumbs, and they lead us not to a single revelation, but to a door, one that we cannot yet open, but which we now know exists. And perhaps that is the true hidden cost of survival for the medieval archer. Not just the coin spent on arrows, or the years of training, but the unspoken debt to a history that will never be fully repaid. Every time an archer loosed an arrow, he participated in a chain of knowledge stretching beyond his lifetime. And in doing so, he risked drawing from a well that someone, somewhere, had already decided must be sealed. The story ends where it began, in the moment between breath and release, where the archer feels the full weight of his craft. It is here, in the tension of the drawn bow, that all the forces of economy, politics, and hidden history converge. And when the string is loosed, what flies through the air is not just an arrow. It is a question, one that still hangs in the silence of centuries. How much of our past was taken from us before we ever had the chance to see it?